You may remember Figma when Adobe tried to acquire them a few years ago. It was one of the
Oh,
biggest acquisitions by Adobe. To be honest, I went and criticized Adobe for such a big acquisition with no real revenue. But this is a phenomenal company. It does design software. So if you're designing applications, this is place where you're going to go design the application and the workflow, and then you're going to get coded with it. They came out public last year, and you've seen the stock down around, let's say, 80% since then, because again, high growth company right in the smack middle of being disrupted by AI models. And, when you had a brand new company, your financials are not the best. So this has been the one that has absolutely been crushed over the last 12 months. But last night they showed that the growth rates are actually picking up. Their AI consumption is improving, and they are not, they're working closely with large language models and helping out their customers.
And I'm so glad you bring out the point that the stock has gotten absolutely crushed, because you take a look at a one-year chart. On August 1st, 2025, it was trading at $122. And of course, yesterday, or prior to this earnings release, it was trading below $20. Now it's above 20, but still a long way off from those highs back in the summer of 2025. You had mentioned, Anurag, that Adobe wanted to buy it, but was stopped by regulators. Is this a takeover target? Is it still a takeover target for anyone?
Well, Adobe would have been the right fit at that time. And again, I go back and say when it happened, I would really criticize Adobe for it. But I seems now it looks like a very good design software. Now, I don't know if it can be acquired now because, as I said, there was some regulatory issue. In the little market that they operate in, Figma operates in, they actually have very high market share. They are the predominant vendor with very little competition from any of the bigger guys. But here the discussion was the reason why it got crushed was people said, well, why don't I just go into a Claude or an OpenAI and start designing my application over there? And these guys are saying, listen, it's not that simple. You can, coding, you can do it anywhere, but designing requires a different skill set. As I said, they have probably the best product that's out there in that category.
hey, Anurag, to what extent is what we're seeing today in Figma kind of emblematic of what maybe a lot of software companies need to do, which is, hey, people have sold your stock, concerned about the AI competitive threat. The only way to get around that is just to perform and put up good numbers. Is this kind of a template for some of these other software companies?
Yeah, Paul, you really nailed it in the head over there. That's exactly what needs to happen. But it was probably a little easier for Figma because the base of revenue is small. And even one or two, they signed a very large client with one of the hyperscale cloud providers. So what happens is when you sign that big of a contract, your growth rate goes up. But when you're a larger company, let's say if you're a Salesforce or a Workday, one or two clients really don't do it for you. That's really a macro play. And, believe it or not, macro right now, tech's doing very well, but macro for non-AI tech is not good. We think things are going to be tough for Salesforce and Workday when they report in a few weeks, because, if you see what's happening with deal activity being pushed up because of the war, because of all the uncertainty around rates, I think, the large software company won't have an easy time to show a rebound in growth rates. So the real kicker has to be that the declining growth rate needs to improve, but it's going to be hard for the larger ones to do it.
Anurag, I want to switch gears and get your take on what's going on with Apple and OpenAI. They have a 2-year partnership, but it's starting to become frayed. This is according to our reporting. Mark Gurman of Bloomberg News reporting on this. The startup OpenAI is failing to see the expected benefits from the deal, and there's now talk of possible legal action here too. Does this go back to the idea that Apple has had a kind of a tough road here figuring out how to deploy its AI strategy?
So I'll take a slightly different angle on this thing. Apple, I think, did a good job at that time to tie up with OpenAI because OpenAI was the best model. And it did, kind of at that point for a short term change the narrative that Apple's embracing. But frankly speaking, if you look at what OpenAI did, they basically started a new firm where they're going to try to do a device that could compete with Apple someday. They've been poaching, engineers from Apple, and frankly, you don't do that to Apple. In fact, Elon Musk also learned it the hard way, a long time ago. You have to work closely with Apple. Apple went out and said, you know what, we're going to license Google model for our models. We're going to allow, and Mark's also reported on that same framework, that when they announce their Worldwide Developers Conference on June 8th, they will showcase that consumers can use all the models and not just OpenAI. So I think there was a little bad blood over there because OpenAI wanted to, compete with Apple, and Apple controls, I think, one of the most important distributions for consumers, and I think it's going to be very tough to work with them.
Anurag, real quickly, it just kind of came across recently. Bill Ackman takes a stake in Microsoft stocks, up a couple of percent here today. He says tech deeply embedded into the ecosystem. What do you make of Ackman and Microsoft?
Yeah, maybe you read our note from back in January when we said, they're just being punished for no reason. They are being punished because they're part of the software bucket. But Microsoft is dead smack one of the most important companies as we see AI grows.